The Galactic Tribute Exchange was the largest slave market in the known universe, and it floated like a dark jewel in the empty space between three dying stars. The station was built from black stone that absorbed all light, and its halls were filled with the screams and whispers of 1,000 conquered species. Commander Alara Vex Thanis stood upon the central platform with her silver skin glowing softly beneath the artificial lights, and her golden eyes swept across the crowds below with complete boredom. She was a high daughter of the Seventh Crest, which meant she was royalty among the Selenari Empire, and she had seen more slave auctions than she could count. The Selenari were the masters of this galaxy, and they had been masters for 10,000 years. Their empire stretched across 100 conquered worlds, and every species they encountered eventually knelt before them or died. It was simply the natural order of things, and Alara had never questioned it. Today, she was here to oversee the collection of tribute species from the newest conquered territory, a small blue planet called Earth in an unremarkable spiral arm of the galaxy. The humans had been subjugated only 2 years ago, and they were considered barely worth cataloging by most Selenari nobles. "Bring forward the next batch," Alara commanded, and her voice echoed through the hall like music made of ice. The guards dragged a group of humans onto the platform, and Alara studied them with mild curiosity. They were strange creatures with their soft skin and their fragile bodies, and she could not understand how they had ever survived on their own world. Most of them kept their heads down and their eyes on the floor, broken by months of captivity. But one of them was different. He was a male human with dark hair and eyes the color of storm clouds, and he stood straight and tall despite the chains on his wrists. There were scars on his face and burns on his arms, but he did not look afraid. He looked like he was waiting for something. His name was Marcus Cole, and he had been the captain of a resistance ship called the Defiance before his capture. The Selenari records said he had destroyed 3 of their patrol vessels before they finally caught him, and they had beaten him for it many times. A fat merchant from the Zelkari species pointed one of his tentacles at Marcus and made a gurgling sound that passed for speech among his kind. "That one," the Zelkari said. "I will take him for the mining colonies. He looks strong enough to last a few years before he breaks." The auctioneer nodded and prepared to mark the sale, but then something unexpected happened. Marcus lifted his head and looked directly at Alara, and he smiled. It was not the smile of a broken slave or a defeated enemy. It was the smile of someone who knew a secret that nobody else knew. "No," Marcus said, and his voice was calm and clear. "I do not think so." Before anyone could react, Marcus moved. His hands twisted in a way that should have been impossible, and suddenly the chains fell from his wrists and clattered to the floor. He had been practicing that trick for 6 months, waiting for exactly this moment. 2 guards rushed toward him with their weapons raised, but Marcus was faster. He ducked under the first guard's swing and used the guard's own momentum to throw him into the second one. Both of them crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs and armor. The crowd screamed and scrambled backward, but Marcus did not run. He did not even try to escape. Instead, he walked calmly toward the central platform where Alara stood frozen in shock. The High Daughter's guards formed a wall in front of her, but Marcus stopped before he reached them. He dropped to one knee on the coal-black floor, and he spoke words that nobody had heard in 10,000 years. His pronunciation was perfect, and his accent was flawless. He spoke in High Selenari, the ancient language of the royal courts, and every word rang through the silent hall like a bell. "I invoke the right of Vethkaran," Marcus said, and his storm-gray eyes locked onto Alara's golden ones. "I claim this woman as my bride." The silence that followed was so complete that Alara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She gasped in astonishment as his words sank into her mind, and her silver skin flushed with a color that might have been anger or might have been something else entirely, You dare call me your bride?" she whispered, and her voice cracked on the last word. The human grinned up at her, and there was something dangerous in that grin, something that made Alara feel like prey for the first time in her life. "I dare," Marcus said simply. Chaos erupted throughout the hall as nobles shouted and guards drew their weapons, but before anyone could strike the human down, an ancient voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Stop." The Keeper of Laws hobbled forward on legs that had carried him for 300 years, and he raised his staff of office high above his head. The staff glowed with the light of ancient power, and everyone in the hall froze where they stood. "The human has invoked the right of Vethkaran," the Keeper announced, and his voice trembled with something that might have been excitement. "This right is sacred and cannot be denied. It is older than the Empire itself." "This is madness," one of the nobles shouted. "He is a slave, a primitive, a creature barely worthy of cleaning our floors." "The law does not discriminate," the Keeper replied, and his ancient eyes found Alara's face. "The right of Vethkaran states that any male of any species may claim a female of higher station as his bride. If he can prove himself worthy through the 3 sacred trials, she must accept him." Alara stepped forward, and her hands were shaking with fury. "You cannot be serious," she hissed at the Keeper. "This human will die in the first trial. No primitive species has ever survived the challenges of Vethkaran." "Then you have nothing to worry about," the Keeper said with a thin smile. "The trials will begin tomorrow at dawn. Until then, the human will be kept in the guest quarters, befitting a potential consort." Marcus rose to his feet, and he was still smiling that infuriating smile. "I look forward to it," he said, and he let the guards lead him away without resistance. Alara watched him go, and she felt something cold settling in her stomach. She had seen many humans since the conquest of Earth, and all of them had been broken and beaten and hopeless. But this one was different. This one had planned something. She did not know what game the human was playing, but she was certain of one thing. Marcus Cole was not a fool, and he had not invoked an ancient ritual on a whim. There was something deeper happening here, something she could not yet see. As the crowd slowly dispersed and the auction continued around her, Alara made a decision. She would discover the truth about this strange human, and she would find out why he had chosen her. And when she did, she would make him regret ever setting foot in her empire. But deep in her heart, beneath the anger and the pride and the certainty of her superiority, there was a small voice that whispered a different message. It whispered that maybe, just maybe, the universe was about to change in ways she could not imagine. She ignored that voice and walked away with her head held high, but she could not forget the way the human had smiled at her. It was the smile of someone who had already won a game that nobody else knew they were playing. The guest quarters they gave Marcus were nicer than any room he had seen since his capture, and he stood by the window looking out at the stars with his hands clasped behind his back. The chains were gone now, and the guards treated him with something almost like respect. After all, he was technically a potential consort to a high daughter. He smiled to himself as he remembered the look on Alara's face when he had spoken the ancient words. She had been so shocked, so completely unprepared for a human to know anything about Selenari culture. That was exactly what he had been counting on. The door behind him slid open, and he turned to see a small delegation of Selenari officials entering the room. They were dressed in formal robes, and they carried data tablets and recording devices. The Keeper of Laws led them, and his ancient face was curious. "Human," the Keeper said, "we must prepare you for the trials. There are rules you must understand and traditions you must follow. Do you speak our language well enough to comprehend these things?" Marcus bowed slightly in the formal Selenari manner. "I speak your language perfectly," he replied in flawless High Selenari, "and I have studied your customs for many months. Please, tell me what I need to know." The officials exchanged surprised glances. They had not expected a human to be so polished or so prepared. What they did not know was that Marcus had spent every moment of his 6 months in captivity learning. He had memorized the Selenari language by listening to his guards. He had studied their history from stolen data files. He had learned their laws from whispered conversations with other prisoners who had been in the Empire longer. The humans in the slave camps had built a network of information, passing knowledge from cell to cell and ship to ship. They had been planning their resistance from the very first day of their capture, and Marcus was not the only one who had been preparing, but he was the one who had been chosen for this mission. The keeper began to explain the 3 trials, and Marcus listened carefully, even though he already knew everything the old Selenari would say. The first trial is called the Trial of Endurance, the keeper explained. You will be sealed in a chamber that cycles through extreme temperatures. It will freeze you and then burn you, over and over again, for 3 days. You will have no food and no water. Most species die within the first few hours. Marcus nodded calmly, and the officials looked at him like he was insane. The second trial is called the Trial of Combat, the keeper continued. You will face a champion of the Selenari warrior caste in single combat. Our warriors train from birth, and they have never been defeated by an outsider. The fight continues until one of you cannot stand. And the third trial? Marcus asked. The keeper's eyes grew dark with something like warning. The third trial is called the Trial of Mind. You will enter a telepathic maze created by our most powerful psychics. The maze is designed to break your sanity and trap you forever in your own nightmares. No alien species has ever emerged with their mind intact. Marcus smiled, and it was the same dangerous smile he had shown Ilara on the auction platform. I understand, he said simply. When do we begin? The officials left shortly after, shaking their heads and muttering about the foolishness of humans. They were certain that Marcus would die in the first trial, and they almost felt sorry for him. He seemed like a nice enough creature for a primitive. But Marcus was not worried. He walked to the small desk in the corner of his room and pulled out a hidden device from the lining of his boot. It was a communication unit, tiny and almost impossible to detect. He had built it himself from scraps stolen over months of captivity. He activated it and spoke softly into the receiver. This is Cole, he said. Phase 1 is complete. I have invoked the right of Vethkaran and claimed the High Daughter. The trials begin tomorrow. A crackling voice replied through the tiny speaker. Confirmed, Captain. The fleet is standing by in the Kethros Nebula. We await your signal. How long until you have access to the network? 3 days for the trials, then the wedding preparations. Give me 2 weeks, and I will have everything we need. Good luck, Captain. Humanity is counting on you. The connection ended, and Marcus hid the device again. He walked back to the window and looked out at the stars. And this time, his smile was tinged with sadness. He was not doing this for glory or adventure. He was doing this for revenge and for freedom. He was doing this for the 40 million people who had died when the Selenari fleet burned New Helsinki to ash. He was doing this for his sister and his little niece, who had been among those 40 million. The Selenari thought humans were weak and primitive and easily broken. They thought that conquering Earth had been just another routine expansion of their mighty empire. They had no idea how wrong they were. Humans were not weak. They were patient. They did not break easily. They bent and they waited and they planned. And when the time was right, they struck back with a fury that their enemies never expected. Marcus Cole was going to survive the 3 trials. He was going to marry the High Daughter of the 7th Crest. And he was going to use her access to the Imperial Communication Network to send a message that would change the galaxy forever. He thought about Ilara as he stood there watching the stars. She was beautiful in a strange alien way, with her silver skin and her golden eyes and her proud bearing. She was also arrogant and cruel and completely blind to the suffering her empire caused. But Marcus had seen something else in her eyes during their brief encounter. He had seen a flicker of doubt, a tiny crack in her certainty. Maybe there was hope for her yet. Or maybe not. It did not really matter. Marcus would complete his mission regardless of what kind of person Alara turned out to be. Meanwhile, in her own chambers on the far side of the station, Alara was having a very different kind of evening. She had ordered her servants to bring her every piece of information they could find about the human called Marcus Cole, and she was reading through the files with growing unease. He had been a captain in the human resistance, commanding a small ship called the Defiance. With only a crew of 30, he had destroyed 3 Selenari patrol vessels before his capture. The report said he had used unconventional tactics and impossible maneuvers that their computers could not predict. Even in captivity, he had caused problems. He had organized work slowdowns in the labor camps. He had taught other prisoners how to hide information from their guards. He had escaped twice before they finally put him in maximum security. And somehow, in the middle of all that chaos, he had learned to speak perfect High Selenari and had memorized an ancient law that most Selenari nobles had never heard of. This was not the behavior of a primitive species. This was the behavior of a dangerous enemy who had been planning something for a very long time. Alara threw the data tablet onto her bed and paced across her chamber with her fists clenched. She should have killed him on the spot when he invoked the ritual. She should have ignored the law and ordered her guards to cut him down. But the law was sacred, and she had been too shocked to react quickly. Now she was trapped in a situation she did not understand. What did the human want from her? Why had he chosen her specifically? There were other Selenari women at the auction, other targets he could have claimed. But he had looked directly at her, and he had smiled like he knew exactly who she was. She needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. Alara made a decision that surprised even herself. She would go to the human's quarters and demand the truth. She would look into his strange gray eyes and force him to explain his plan. And if she did not like what she heard, she would find a way to destroy him, ancient law or no ancient law. She did not know it yet, but that conversation would change her life forever. It would shake everything she believed about her empire and her people and herself. It would be the first step on a path that led to places she could not imagine. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, she simply wanted answers. And Marcus Cole was going to give them to her, whether he wanted to or not. The trial of endurance began at dawn, and the entire station gathered to watch. Nobles filled the observation galleries above the trial chamber, and merchants and slaves crowded around viewing screens throughout the halls. Everyone wanted to see the foolish human die. Marcus stood in the center of the chamber wearing nothing but simple cloth pants, and his scarred body was exposed for all to see. The burns and cuts from his time in captivity marked his skin like a map of suffering, but he stood straight and proud. Alara watched from the highest gallery, her golden eyes fixed on the human below. She had gone to his quarters the night before, but he had been sleeping, and she had not been able to bring herself to wake him. Now she wished she had, because she might never get another chance to question him. The Keeper of Laws raised his staff, and silence fell across the chamber. "Let the trial of endurance begin," he announced. "May the ancient traditions judge this challenger worthy or wanting." The chamber doors sealed shut with a sound like thunder, and then the temperature began to drop. The cold came fast and brutal, plunging from comfortable to freezing in minutes. Frost formed on the walls and floor, and Marcus could see his breath turning to ice crystals in front of his face. The Selenari in the galleries leaned forward, expecting him to collapse at any moment. But Marcus did not collapse. He began to move. He paced in a slow circle, keeping his muscles active and his blood flowing. He had studied human survival techniques during his training as a pilot, and he knew that movement was the key to surviving extreme cold. As long as he kept moving, his body would generate heat. The Selenari did not understand what they were seeing. Their species dealt with cold by entering a hibernation state, slowing their metabolism until the danger passed. They had never encountered a species that fought the cold with activity. Hours passed, and Marcus kept moving. He did jumping exercises and stretches, and anything else he could think of to keep warm. His skin turned blue and his fingers went numb, but he refused to stop. The watchers began to murmur in confusion. The humans should have died by now. Every other species that had attempted this trial had frozen solid within the first few hours. Then the heat came. The temperature shot upward like a rocket, and suddenly Marcus was standing in an oven. Sweat poured from his body and steam rose from his blue skin. The air itself seemed to burn. Marcus dropped to the floor and pressed himself against the cold stone, using the lingering chill to cool his body. He breathed slowly and steadily, refusing to panic. Humans had evolved on a world with extreme temperature variations, and their bodies were built to adapt. The cycle continued for 3 days. Cold and heat, over and over again until Marcus lost all sense of time. He did not sleep. He barely rested. He simply endured. On the morning of the 4th day, the chamber doors opened, and Marcus Cole walked out on his own 2 feet. He was burned and frostbitten and half dead from dehydration, but he was walking. He was alive. He had done the impossible. The crowd was silent with shock, and even the Keeper of Laws seemed shaken. No alien species had ever survived the trial of endurance. The humans were supposed to be weak. Alara gripped the railing of her gallery so hard that her silver knuckles turned white. She could not believe what she was seeing. This human had just accomplished something that should have been impossible. Medical personnel rushed to tend to Marcus, but he waved them away. He looked up at Alara's gallery and smiled that infuriating smile. 1 down, he called out. 2 to go. The trial of combat took place 2 days later, after Marcus had been given time to recover. He stood in the arena with a simple sword in his hand, facing the greatest warrior the Selenari could produce. His opponent was called Vathan the Undefeated, and he had earned that name by killing over 100 challengers in ritual combat. He was 8 feet tall, with 4 arms and skin like stone, and he moved with a speed that seemed impossible for his size. "You are brave, little human," Vathan rumbled, "but bravery will not save you. I will try to make your death quick." Marcus did not respond. He simply raised his sword and waited. The fight began with Vathan charging forward like an avalanche, and Marcus dove to the side at the last possible moment. The Selenari champion's blade missed him by inches. What followed was the strangest combat the Watchers had ever seen. Marcus did not fight like a warrior. He fought like a survivor. He dodged and ran and used every piece of the arena as a weapon. He threw sand in Vathan's eyes and kicked dust at his feet. He used the columns and walls as shields and obstacles. The Selenari in the crowd booed and jeered. This was not honorable combat. This was the fighting style of a coward. But Marcus did not care about honor. He cared about winning. He had studied Selenari physiology during his captivity, and he had discovered something interesting. The Selenari had a blind spot in their peripheral vision, a small gap where their 4 eyes could not see. It was tiny and almost impossible to exploit, but Marcus had practiced for months. He waited until Vathan was tired and frustrated, and then he struck. He moved into the blind spot and attacked from an angle the champion could not see. His sword found the gap in Vathan's armor, and the great warrior fell. The crowd gasped in disbelief. Vathan the Undefeated had been defeated by a human. Marcus stood over his fallen opponent. breathing hard but victorious. He looked up at the stunned faces in the galleries and raised his bloody sword. "Two down," he said. The trial of mind was the final challenge, and it was supposed to be the most deadly. The Selenari psychics who created the telepathic maze were the most powerful minds in the Empire, and they had destroyed thousands of challenges over the centuries. Marcus was led to a dark chamber where three ancient Selenari sat in a circle. Their eyes glowed with psychic power, and the air hummed with mental energy. "Enter the maze, little human," they whispered in unison, "and let us see what lurks in the depths of your primitive mind." Marcus felt the psychic attack hit him like a wave, and suddenly he was no longer in the chamber. He was standing in a twisted landscape made of his own memories and fears. Walls shifted around him, and shadows reached for him with grasping hands. The psychics expected him to panic. They expected his mind to shatter under their assault. But they had never tried to break a human mind before. Human minds were chaos. Marcus's thoughts jumped from memory to memory without warning. Emotions crashed into logic and dreams mixed with reality. His brain was a storm of contradictions that the psychics could not navigate. They tried to trap him in his fears, but his fears kept changing. They tried to find his weaknesses, but his weaknesses were tangled up with his strengths. They tried to destroy his sense of self, but his sense of self was built on adaptability and change. Marcus walked through the maze humming an old Earth song, and the psychic constructs fell apart around him. His mind was too messy and too resilient to trap. It bent and flexed and refused to break. When he emerged from the trance an hour later, the three psychics were unconscious from exhaustion, and Marcus was smiling. 3 trials complete, the Keeper of Laws announced in a voice that trembled with shock. The human Marcus Cole has proven himself worthy. By the ancient rite of Vethkaran, he has earned the hand of High Daughter Alara Vexthanis. The crowd erupted in chaos. Some were angry, and some were amazed, and some were simply confused. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Alara pushed her way through the crowd until she was standing face to face with Marcus. Her golden eyes searched his gray ones, looking for answers she could not find. "How?" she whispered. "Your species is supposed to be nothing. You are supposed to be weak and primitive and easily broken. How did you do this?" Marcus looked at her, and for a moment his smile faded. She could see exhaustion in his eyes, and pain, and something else she could not name. "That is the thing about humans," he said softly. "We are really good at being underestimated. Everyone thinks we are weak because we are small and soft and short-lived. But we are not weak. We are patient. We endure. We adapt. And we never, ever give up." He reached out and took her hand, and his touch was surprisingly gentle. "You wanted to know why I chose you," he said. "Come with me tonight, and I will tell you everything. I think you deserve to know the truth before we are married." Alara should have refused. She should have pulled away and ordered her guards to arrest him despite the law. But something in his eyes stopped her. She nodded slowly, and her fingers tightened around his. "Tonight," she agreed, "you will tell me everything." And he would. He would tell her things that would shatter her world and rebuild it in a new shape. He would show her truths that her empire had hidden for centuries. And she would have to choose what kind of person she wanted to be. But that was for tonight. Right now, she could only stare at the impossible human who had just conquered the unconquerable. The night was quiet in Marcus's quarters, and the stars outside the window burned cold and distant. Alara stood near the door with her arms crossed, watching the human who had just turned her world upside down. By Selenari law, she was now bound to marry him. She still could not believe it. Marcus sat on the edge of his bed, and he looked different now that they were alone. The confident smile was gone, replaced by something more tired and more honest. He gestured to a chair across from him. "Please sit," he said softly. This is going to be a long conversation, and you deserve to hear it comfortably." Alara hesitated, then moved to the chair and lowered herself into it. Her golden eyes never left his face. "Talk," she commanded. "Tell me why you did this. Tell me what you want from me. I am tired of mysteries." Marcus nodded slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was heavy with emotion. "Your father commands the 7th Fleet," he said. "Do you know what the 7th Fleet did 2 years ago, in the first month of the war against humanity?" Alara felt a chill run through her silver skin. She knew about the war, of course, but the details had always been kept vague. Military operations were classified. "They conquered your world," she said carefully. "They brought humanity into the Empire. It was a standard subjugation campaign." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It was bitter and broken. "Is that what they told you?" he asked. "A standard subjugation campaign?" He stood up and walked to the window, pressing his hand against the cold glass. "Your father's fleet arrived at a human colony called New Helsinki," he said. "It was a peaceful world, mostly farmers and families. They had already agreed to surrender. They had sent messages offering complete compliance with Selenari rule." His voice cracked, and Alara saw his shoulders tighten. "The 7th Fleet burned them anyway. They glassed the entire planet from orbit. 40 million people died in a single day, including my sister and my 8-year-old niece. They were not soldiers. They were not fighters. They were just people trying to live their lives." Alara felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. She wanted to deny it, wanted to say that her father would never do such a thing. But something in Marcus's voice told her he was not lying. "Why?" She whispered, "Why would they destroy a world that had already surrendered?" Marcus turned to face her, and his gray eyes were filled with a pain she could not imagine. "Because they wanted to send a message," he said. "They wanted to show humanity what would happen if we resisted. They thought that mass murder would break our spirit and make us easy to control." He laughed again, and this time the bitterness was mixed with something darker. "They were wrong. All they did was give us a reason to fight. All they did was unite every human in the galaxy against them. Your empire created its own worst enemy." Alara's mind was racing. She thought about all the things she had been taught since childhood. She had been told that the Selenari brought order to chaos and civilization to primitives. She had been told that their conquests were acts of mercy. But what if that was all lies? "Even if this is true," she said slowly, "what does it have to do with me? Why did you invoke the right of Vethkaran? Why did you claim me as your bride?" Marcus sat back down and looked at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Because you are the key to everything," he said. "As the bride of a high daughter of the 7th Crest, I will have access to the Imperial Communication Network. I will be able to send and receive messages through channels that are supposed to be unbreakable." Understanding dawned in Alara's eyes. "You want information," she breathed. "You want to use my access codes to spy on the Empire." "Not just spy," Marcus corrected. "I want the coordinates of every human slave camp in the Empire. I want the locations of your weapons platforms and defense stations. I want the security codes that your military thinks are unbreakable." He leaned forward, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "Humanity is not finished fighting. We have been building a fleet in secret, hiding in the dark nebula of Kethros where your sensors cannot reach. We have ships and weapons and soldiers who are ready to die for freedom. All we need is a map." Alara stared at him in shock. This was treason. This was revolution. This was the end of everything she knew. "You would use me," she said, and her voice trembled. "You would make me a traitor to my own people. You would turn me into a weapon against my own empire." Marcus shook his head. "I am giving you a choice," he said. "Something your empire never gave us. You can help me, or you can refuse. But either way, you deserve to know the truth. He stood up and walked to a hidden panel in the wall. He pressed a sequence of buttons, and a data screen flickered to life. Images began to flash across the surface, and Alara felt her heart sink with every one. She saw recordings of slave camps where humans were worked to death. She saw execution orders signed by nobles she had known her entire life. She saw evidence of massacres and atrocities that made New Helsinki look small. It was not just humans. There were other species too, dozens of them, all suffering under Selenari rule. The Thoxins and the Vili and countless others all crying out for freedom that never came. "This is what your empire really is," Marcus said quietly. "This is what you have been defending your whole life. I am not asking you to betray your people. I am asking you to look at the truth and decide what kind of person you want to be." Ilara's hands were shaking. Tears that she did not know she could cry were streaming down her silver cheeks. Everything she had believed, everything she had been taught, everything she had trusted, it was all falling apart. "I did not know," she whispered. "I swear to you, I did not know." Marcus knelt beside her chair and looked up into her golden eyes. "I believe you," he said, and his voice was gentle now. "You were raised in a lie, just like everyone else in your empire. The people at the top keep the truth hidden so the people like you will never question their power." He took her hand, and this time she did not pull away. "You have a choice now," he said. "You can pretend you never saw any of this and go back to your comfortable life. You can marry me and ignore everything I have shown you. Or you can help me change the galaxy." Alara looked at the images still flickering on the screen. She saw a human child crying over the body of her mother. She saw a Thoxan elder being beaten by Selenari guards. She saw suffering that she could no longer pretend did not exist. Something broke inside her, and something new began to grow in its place. "If I help you," she said slowly, "what happens to my people? What happens to the Selenari who are not responsible for these crimes?" Marcus squeezed her hand. "The rebellion is not about revenge," he said. "It is about freedom. We do not want to destroy the Selenari. We want to end an empire that hurts everyone, including your own people. When this is over, there can be peace between all species. But first, the tyrants have to fall." Alara was silent for a long moment, and Marcus did not rush her. He understood that she was fighting the hardest battle of her life, the battle between who she had been and who she could become. Finally, she lifted her head and met his eyes. "I will help you," she said, and her voice was steady despite the tears on her face. "Not because I owe you anything, and not because you have convinced me to betray my people. I will help you because I cannot be part of this lie anymore. I will help you because my empire has become something I cannot defend." Marcus smiled, and for the first time, it was not the dangerous grin of a man with a plan. It was the warm smile of someone who had found an unexpected ally. "Together then," he said. "Together," Alara agreed. And in that small room, under the light of distant stars, a princess of the conquerors and a captain of the conquered began to plan a revolution that would change the galaxy forever. The imperial wedding was the greatest spectacle the galaxy had seen in a generation, and it was broadcast across 1,000 worlds. Every noble house sent representatives, and the emperor himself traveled from the capital to witness the strange union between a high daughter and a human slave. The great hall of the imperial palace was decorated with flowers from 100 planets, and the light of 3 suns streamed through crystal windows to bathe everything in golden light. Thousands of guests filled the seats, and millions more watched on screens throughout the empire. Alara stood at the altar in a gown of white silk and silver thread, and she had never looked more beautiful or more afraid. Beside her stood Marcus Cole in formal Selenari robes, and his storm-gray eyes were calm despite the danger surrounding them. The emperor sat on his throne at the head of the hall, watching the ceremony with an amused smile on his ancient face. He was so old that his silver skin had faded to gray, and his golden eyes were clouded with age. But his mind was still sharp, and he found the whole situation entertaining. "A human husband," he chuckled to his advisors. "Let the girl have her exotic pet. It changes nothing. Humans are barely more than animals." His advisors laughed politely, and none of them noticed the look that passed between Marcus and Ilara. Beneath her ceremonial robes, Ilara's fingers touched a small device hidden in her sleeve. It was connected to the Imperial communication network, and it was waiting for her command. One signal from her, and Marcus's message would fly across the galaxy. The Keeper of Laws stood before them, reading from an ancient scroll. The words were traditional and beautiful, speaking of bonds that could not be broken and promises that would last forever. "To you, Ilara Vexthanis, High Daughter of the Seventh Crest, accept this male as your husband and partner for all the days of your life." Ilara looked at Marcus, and she saw everything in his eyes. She saw pain and hope and determination. She saw the memory of 40 million dead. She saw the dream of freedom for all species. "I accept him," she said clearly. "And do you, Marcus Cole of the human species, accept this female as your wife and partner for all the days of your life?" Marcus smiled, and this time it was the real smile, the one that Ilara had come to treasure. "I accept her," he said. The keeper raised his staff. "Then by the ancient laws of our people, I declare you husband and wife. What the traditions have joined, let no power divide." The crowd applauded politely, though many of them were clearly uncomfortable with the idea of a human joining a noble house. But their discomfort was about to become the least of their problems. As the applause died down, Ilara pressed the device in her sleeve. The signal went out instantly, writing the encrypted channels of the Imperial network. It carried coordinates and codes and maps and everything Marcus had gathered during his weeks as her betrothed. And it flew to every corner of the galaxy at the speed of light. In the dark nebula of Kethros, hidden ships received the signal and powered up their engines. In slave camps across the Empire, secret communication devices buzzed with hope. In the halls of conquered species, leaders who had waited for generations finally saw a chance for freedom. The revolution had begun. Alarms started blaring throughout the palace, and guards rushed in with weapons drawn. The Emperor rose from his throne with fury on his ancient face. "What is happening?" he demanded. "What have you done?" Ilara stepped forward, and her voice rang through the hall like a bell. "I have done what should have been done centuries ago," she declared. "I have shown the galaxy the truth about our empire. I have sent evidence of every atrocity, every massacre, every crime that our leaders have committed in the name of order." The crowd erupted in chaos. Nobles screamed and guards shouted. But Ilara was not finished. "And I have given the coordinates of our defenses to every species we have ever conquered," she continued. "The human fleet is no longer alone. They are joined by the Thoxans and the Vili and dozens of others who have suffered under our rule. Our empire ends today." The Emperor's face twisted with rage. "Seize them," he screamed. "Kill them both." Guards rushed forward, but they never reached the altar. The ceiling of the Great Hall exploded inward as human dropships crashed through the crystal windows. Soldiers in battle armor poured out, their weapons blazing. Marcus grabbed Ilara's hand and pulled her toward the nearest dropship. "Time to go," he shouted over the noise of battle. They ran through the chaos, dodging guards and leaping over fallen debris. Ilara's wedding gown tore on the broken stones, and Marcus's formal robes were splattered with dust. But they kept moving. Behind them, the palace was falling. Above them, the sky was filled with ships from a dozen species, all united against the empire that had oppressed them. And across the galaxy, slaves were rising and tyrants were falling. They reached the dropship just as a squad of elite guards closed in. Marcus pushed Alara through the hatch and turned to face their pursuers. "Go," he yelled. "I will hold them off." "No," Alara shouted back, and she grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "We do this together, remember?" She pulled him into the ship, and the hatch sealed behind them. The dropship lifted off and shot into the sky, leaving the burning palace behind. Through the viewport, they watched the battle raging below. Selenari warships were engaging the rebel fleet, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Empire was losing. Marcus and Alara sat together in the back of the dropship, holding hands as the galaxy changed around them. They were both exhausted and terrified, and strangely hopeful. "What happens now?" Alara asked. Marcus looked at her with wonder in his eyes. This woman had been raised to rule an empire, and she had given it all up for freedom. He had never met anyone so brave. "Now we fight," he said. "Now we build something better. Now we show the galaxy that no species has to kneel to another." The war lasted 3 years, and it was brutal and bloody and terrible. But in the end, the empire fell. The tyrants were brought to justice, and the slaves were set free. The Selenari people were not destroyed, but their government was rebuilt on principles of equality and peace. Marcus Cole became a legend, the human who had brought down an empire with nothing but courage and patience and an impossible plan. Statues were built in his honor, and children across the galaxy learned his story. But Marcus did not care about fame or statues. He cared about the woman who stood beside him through everything. Alara Vexthanis became something unprecedented. She was a Selenari who fought against her own kind, not out of hatred, but out of hope for what her people might become. She worked tirelessly to help rebuild the galaxy, and she never forgot the lessons she had learned. When asked about her husband, she always laughed. "He called me his bride before we had ever spoken," she would say. "I should have known then that he was either insane or brilliant." With humans, it is usually both. And when asked about humans in general, her answer was always the same. "They do not ask permission," she would say. "They just decide what the future should be and drag everyone else along with them. It is their most infuriating trait." Then her golden eyes would soften and she would smile. "And they're most magnificent." Marcus and Alara lived long lives together, working side by side to build a galaxy where no species dominated another. They had children who carried both human determination and Selenari wisdom. And they never forgot the day when a human slave had looked at an alien princess and smiled. Because that smile had changed everything. It had proven that humans did not accept defeat. They did not stay beaten. They did not surrender to impossible odds. They just took longer to win. And when they finally won, they made sure the victory was worth the wait. The galaxy was free because one human had dared to reach for something impossible. And one Selenari had dared to reach back. That was the lesson of Marcus Cole and Alara Vexthanis. That was the legacy they left behind. Hope is the most dangerous weapon in the universe. And humans never run out of it.